The year is 1654. Colonial Virginia breathes heavily, the air thick with the scent of curing tobacco and something else, an unspoken tension, a question too dangerous to ask aloud. It moves through the fields in whispers, quiet, lethal, unforgivable. This was no ordinary curiosity. It was an accusation, a direct threat to the fragile order holding colonial society together, a truth so scandalous that acknowledging it would mean tearing the system apart. Why does the master's youngest son have my brother's eyes, his face, his hands? The man who dared to voice that question was an African servant named John Punch. The man who heard it, the plantation overseer, understood immediately what it meant. From that moment on, his own fate became entangled with a secret powerful men could not allow to survive. Within 48 hours, one man would be dead, his secret buried beneath Virginia soil. Another would be swallowed by the law itself, condemned to a punishment without end. In that moment, John Punch became something unprecedented, the first human being in English America legally sentenced to lifelong servitude. What the colonial court buried in 1640 was not just a body. It was a blueprint, a silent legal precedent that would evolve into an institution, one that would consume millions of lives and define a nation for centuries. Before we go deeper into the story of John Punch and the devastating question that altered American history forever, I want you to do something. If you're listening from Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere in the United States, leave a comment telling us which state you're from. This is not just a story. It is a forgotten cornerstone of American history, one that deserves to be brought into the light. Subscribe now, because what you're about to hear has been meticulously reconstructed from colonial court records, documents hidden away for nearly 400 years, a truth you won't find in any standard textbook. Now let me take you back to a world that no longer exists, a time when skin color had not yet been fully codified as destiny, but when one man's search for truth began carving that line permanently and mercilessly into blood and law. Virginia, 1638. The colony was a fragile, ambitious endeavor barely 30 years removed from the desperate struggles of Jamestown's first settlers. It was a land of stark contrasts, breathtaking natural beauty juxtaposed with the brutal realities of survival. A patchwork of struggling tobacco plantations clung precariously to the fertile banks of the James River and the Chesapeake Bay, each a small, isolated outpost of English ambition in a vast, untamed wilderness. Jamestown, the fledgling capital, was less a city and more a collection of rough, hew-kneed wooden structures, dirt roads that turned to mud with every rain, and a constant hum of activity driven by the insatiable demand for tobacco in Europe. Here, English settlers, African servants, and European indentured laborers toiled side by side, their sweat mingling in the rich soil under a legal system that, for all its innate complexities, made surprisingly little distinction between them based on their origins. Servitude, for most, was understood as a temporary condition. Contracts were signed, terms were served, and freedom, often accompanied by a small parcel of land and some tools, was granted regardless of where one had come from, be it the crowded streets of London or the distant shores of West Africa. The air in Virginia during the long, humid summer months was a palpable presence, thick and oppressive, clinging to skin and clothing like a suffocating shroud. The mosquitoes born from the vast marshes and stagnant waters rose in relentless clouds at dusk, their high-pitched whine a constant, maddening soundtrack to the lives of those who worked the fields. The tobacco plants, the colony's lifeblood, grew tall and broad-leafed, their verdant expanse stretching towards the shimmering ribbon of the James River, where each autumn merchant ships with their towering masts and billowing sails would arrive, eager to carry the precious harvest back to the bustling markets of England. The soil, though rich and promising, was relentlessly demanding, requiring constant back-breaking attention, clearing, planting, weeding, harvesting, and finally the delicate process of curing. It was the kind of labor that aged men prematurely, etching lines of exhaustion and hardship onto their faces. John Punch arrived in Virginia sometime around 1630, his journey a harrowing testament to human endurance. He had been brought from the West African coast, a place of vibrant cultures and ancient traditions, on a ship whose name, mercifully perhaps, has been lost to the annals of history. The transatlantic voyage had been a nightmare of 3 months, a blur of darkness, the suffocating stench of unwashed bodies packed too close together, and the relentless hypnotic roar of the ocean against the hull. He was not a slave upon his arrival. The very word, with its connotations of permanent inherited bondage, held no legal weight in English Virginia at that time. He was a servant bound by a contract, albeit one he had not willingly signed, to a planter named Hugh Gwynn. Hugh Gwynn was a man in his early 42nds, a second son from a minor gentry family in Wales. He had come to Virginia, like so many others, seeking the fortune that had eluded him in the rigid class structure of England. He was a practical man, neither overtly cruel nor particularly kind, driven by the SI. Angular, consuming obsession of making his modest plantation profitable. In a colony where tobacco prices fluctuated wildly, where fortunes could be amassed or lost in a single harvest, Gwynn's ambition was both his greatest strength and his most defining characteristic. He lived with his wife, Ella Lanina, a pale, quiet woman who rarely ventured beyond the confines of the main house, and their 3 children. 2 daughters had been sent back to England for their education, a common practice among the more affluent planters, and a son, Thomas, who had recently returned from abroad. Punch worked the fields alongside 2 other servants, men who, despite their vastly different origins, shared the common bond of indentured servitude. There was James Gregory, a Scotsman with a distinctive scar across his left cheek. A memento from a childhood accident, Gregory was a talker, a man who filled the silence of their shared cabin with boisterous stories of his homeland, tales of the Scottish Highlands, of clan feuds and ancient loyalties that had ultimately driven him across the vast ocean. He had signed his indenture contract in Glasgow, a desperate measure to escape a blood feud that would have undoubtedly cost him his life had he remained. He was 28, with fiery red hair that had begun to recede at the crown and hands calloused from years of relentless labor. Gregory possessed a quick temper, but also a quicker, infectious laugh, and he had been the first to extend a hand of friendship to Punch when the African arrived at Gwynn's plantation. The other was Victor, a Dutchman whose surname, like so many of the forgotten, was never recorded. Victor was Gregory's antithesis, a silent, brooding man who spoke only when absolutely necessary, keeping his thoughts and emotions carefully guarded. He hailed from Amsterdam, a city of canals and commerce, and had come to Virginia as part of a failed colonization effort by the Dutch West India Company. When the venture collapsed, Victor, burdened by debt, had sold himself into servitude to settle his accounts. He was 32, tall and lean, with pale blue eyes that seemed to observe everything while revealing nothing of his inner world. Victor had a peculiar habit of carving small wooden figures in the evenings, his knife moving with practiced precision, shaping animals and faces from scraps of wood, a silent testament to a hidden artistry. Punch, in his mid-20s, was lean and powerfully built, his quiet demeanor masking a sharp intelligence that made him invaluable to Gwynn. He possessed an innate understanding of the land, able to read the subtle shifts in the weather, predict the optimal time for the tobacco harvest, and mend broken tools with an almost intuitive skill. He had learned English remarkably quickly, absorbing the language from the other servants and the tur commands of the overseers in the fields. He was a man who kept to himself, yet commanded a quiet respect from his fellow laborers. Gregory, with his characteristic insight, once remarked that Punch had a way of seeing things others missed. Victor, ever laconic, simply called him the Watcher. The Gwynn plantation, though modest by the standards of the wealthier planters, was a self-contained world. 40 acres of cleared land, the main house built of wood and brick, the 2 servant cabins, and the essential tobacco barn where the harvested leaves underwent their transformative cure. Behind the main house, a vegetable garden, meticulously tended by Eleanor Gwynn and an elderly servant woman named Bess, provided sustenance. A small orchard of apple trees, planted when the plantation was first established, offered shade and fruit. The James River, wide and slow-moving, a ribbon of brown water reflecting the vast Virginia sky, was visible from the fields, a company, instant reminder of the distant world beyond their isolated existence, a world connected by the ships that pied its waters. But beneath the veneer of daily toil and the rhythm of the seasons, something else festered on that plantation, a subtle, insidious unease that gnawed at John Punch every waking moment. Hugh Gwyn's youngest son, a boy of about 12 named Thomas, had recently returned from England, where he had been sent to live with relatives. The boy was undeniably English in his pallor, with light brown hair and a narrow, aristocratic face. Yet his eyes, his mouth, the very shape of his hands, they were unmistakable. They belonged to someone else. Punch had a brother. His name was Kofi, and he had been taken from the same village in West Africa, torn from their family by the brutal efficiency of slave traders. They had been separated on the coast, sold to different ships, and brought to Virginia 2 years before Punch. After his own arrival, Punch had spent agonizing months searching for news of Kofi, asking every African servant he encountered if they had seen a man with his brother's distinctive face, his resonant voice, his particular way of moving. He found him in the spring of 1636. Kofi had been working on a neighboring plantation, owned by a man named William Evans. Evans was a formidable figure in the colony, a wealthy planter who served in the colonial assembly, a man of considerable influence who owned over 200 acres of prime tobacco land. The reunion between the brothers had been agonizingly brief, a stolen hour on a rare Sunday afternoon, when both plantations had granted their servants a precious day of rest. The two brothers had sat beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree that marked the boundary between the two properties, and they had spoken in their native language, the words tumbling out in a torrent of emotion, memory, and shared sorrow. Kofi had changed. His hands, once smooth and strong, were now scarred and calloused from relentless fieldwork. His face was gaunt, etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, and his eyes, those deep, dark pools that Punch knew so well, held a profound sorrow that defied words. He spoke to Punch of the Evans plantation, of the endless labor of the ever-present overseer of the grand main house where William Evans lived with his wife Margaret. Margaret, Kofi mentioned, was a woman of striking beauty, but also, it was whispered, a woman of profound loneliness. Kofi didn't elaborate much on Margaret Evans, but there was a subtle shift in his voice when he spoke her name, a fleeting shadow that crossed his face, which stirred a deep, unsettling unease within Punch. Punch saw his brother only twice more after that first reunion. The second time was in the autumn of 1636, another brief clandestine meeting at the boundary. Kofi seemed more withdrawn, more troubled, his words few and far between. The third and final time was in the spring of 1637. Kofi's hands were even more scarred, his face more gaunt, but his eyes remained the same, dark, deep, and filled with an unspeakable sorrow. He confessed to Punch that he was afraid that something was happening on the Evans plantation, something he couldn't quite explain, something that felt dangerous and wrong. And then, as quickly as he had appeared in Punch's life again, he was gone. 3 months later, Kofi was dead. The official cause, as recorded in the Colonial Register, was fever, a common enough ailment in the Virginia summer when the oppressive heat and the swarms of mosquitoes brought sickness that could fell a man in mere days. But Punch heard whispers, fragments of hushed conversations among the servants, rumors that circulated like a fever itself. Kofi had been seen near the main house late at night in the weeks leading up to his death. Margaret Evans, it was said, had been heard weeping inconsolably in the days before Kofi's demise. And then, just like that, Kofi was gone, buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the Evans plantation. His death reduced to a single chilling line in the colonial records: African servant deceased. When Thomas Gwyn returned from England in 1638, Punch saw his brother's face in the boy's features with an almost visceral shock. It was impossible, a notion that defied all logic and social order, and yet it was undeniably, terrifyingly true. The precise shape of the eyes, the subtle curve of the mouth, the elegant length of the fingers, they were Kofi's. Punch said nothing at first. He watched, he waited. And the more he watched, the more an undeniable, horrifying certainty began to solidify within him. Thomas Gwynn was a quiet boy, unusually so for his age. He was studious and serious, with a profound love of books that set him apart from the other children in the colony, who were often more concerned with riding and hunting. He had spent 5 formative years in England, living with his mother's relatives in a small, idyllic village in Kent. He had returned to Virginia, not just with a trunk full of leather-bound books, but with a head brimming with ideas about the wider world, a world far removed from the raw, untamed wilderness of the colony. He was unfailingly polite to the servants, never cruel, and he possessed a peculiar habit of observing them at their work with a curious, thoughtful expression that, for Punch, was deeply unsettling. The boy's eyes were dark, a shade deeper than his father's, darker even than his mother's. His hands were long and graceful, with fingers that seemed almost too delicate for the rough, demanding work of a plantation, and his mouth, when he allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile, curved in a way that Punch had seen only once before on his brother's face. Punch, driven by an instinct he could not suppress, began to ask subtle questions. He spoke to the other servants, particularly those who had been in Virginia longer, those who possessed an intimate knowledge of the colony's intricate web of gossip and secrets, whispers that circulated through the isolated plantations like a persistent, unseen wind. He learned that Margaret Evans had indeed given birth to a son in 1626, a boy who had been sent to England almost immediately after his birth, supposedly to be raised by distant relatives. He learned that William Evans, the powerful planter, had been conspicuously absent from his plantation for several months prior to the boy's birth. Traveling to England on what was described as important business, he learned with a chilling certainty that Margaret Evans had been seen in the company of Kofi, the African servant, in the months leading up to the boy's conception, and then the final devastating piece of the puzzle. He learned that Kofi had died just 3 months after Thomas Gwynn, the boy with Kofi's eyes, had returned to Virginia. The pieces of the puzzle were now all there, scattered and incomplete, yet Punch could discern the terrifying shape of the truth, and the truth in its raw, unvarnished form was impossible, dangerous, and utterly unthinkable in the rigid social order of colonial Virginia. It was late September 1638, and the tobacco harvest was reaching its feverish peak. The air, thick with humidity, hung heavy and still, a suffocating blanket over the land. The fields, stretching endlessly under a pale, washed-out blue sky, buzzed with the incessant drone of insects, a relentless symphony of summer. The sun beat down with an almost malevolent intensity, its rays baking the earth and searing the skin, making the already arduous work almost unbearable. Punch, Gray, Gory, and Victor toiled side by side, their movements synchronized by years of shared labor, cutting the broad, sticky tobacco leaves and carefully hanging them in the cavernous barn to cure. The leaves were heavy, coated with a viscous sap that stained their hands a deep brown and soaked their rough clothing with sweat. The air was pungent with the sweet, earthy aroma of the drying tobacco, a smell that permeated everything, clinging to their skin and hair. The overseer, Robert, watched them from the meager shade of a lone gin-eld oak tree at the edge of the field. Sweet was a man forged in the crucible of colonial hardship, thin and wiry, his face like weathered leather, his eyes perpetually narrowed against the sun. His voice, when he chose to use it, was a sharp cutting instrument that could slice through the den of the fields. In his late 30s, had once been an indentured servant himself, a man who had clawed his way up to a position of authority through a potent combination of ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty to Hugh Gwynn. He carried a stout stick, not typically for beating. Gwynn, for all his pragmatism, did not condone overt brutality, but for pointing, for emphasis, for asserting his absolute control, he wore a wide-brimmed hat, its felt stained with sweat to shield his face from the relentless sun, and his eyes, perpetually scanning, were always moving, always watching, always calculating. Sweet had cultivated a formidable reputation throughout the colony. He was known as a man who delivered results, who could extract more labor from servants than any other overseer, who possessed an uncanny ability to sniff out trouble before it could fully materialize. He was also whispered to be a keeper of secrets, a man who knew things about the planters and their families, intimate details that, if revealed, could shatter reputations and utterly destroy lives. S. Wheat was not a man to be crossed, and every soul on the Gwyn plantation understood this unspoken truth implicitly. Punch had maintained a profound silence all morning, his thoughts a tumultuous storm beneath his calm exterior, but the question, a dangerous burning ember, had been smoldering within him for months, threatening to consume him. It was the kind of question that could earn a man a brutal whipping or far, far worse, but he could no longer contain its explosive power. The sight of Thomas Gwyn earlier that morning strolling through the fields, his dark eyes observing the servants at their toil, his long, delicate fingers idly turning the pages of a book, had been the final unbearable catalyst. Punch had seen his brother Kofi in every subtle line of the boy's face, in every unconscious gesture, and the crushing weight of the secret, the impossible truth, had become an unbearable burden. As Sweet, his shadow, long and distorted in the late afternoon sun, walked past him, Punch straightened his aching back, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and spoke. His voice, though low, was steady, imbued with a quiet, desperate resolve. "Mr. Sweet," he said, the words cutting through the drone of the insects, "I need to ask you something." Sweet stopped abruptly, turning slowly, his eyes narrowing with immediate suspicion. The other servants nearby, Gregory and Victor, their movements momentarily frozen, and two others, a young Englishman named Peter and an older African named Samuel, all ceased their work, their gazes fixed on Punch. The air seemed to grow impossibly heavier. The buzzing of the insects suddenly amplified a deafening roar in the sudden silence. "What is it, Punch?" Sweet's voice was flat, devoid of any discernible emotion. A dangerous calm. Punch hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, with a surge of courage born of desperation, he uttered the words that would shatter his world. "The boy, young Master Thomas, why does he look exactly like my brother?" The words hung in the oppressive air like a noxious smoke, thick and suffocating. Gregory's eyes widened in disbelief and terror, and he instinctively took a step back as if to distance himself from the impending catastrophe. Victor's hand, gripping the sharp tobacco knife, tightened until his knuckles were white. Peter and Samuel exchanged quick, fearful glances, their faces paling visibly. Sweet's face, initially pale with shock, rapidly flushed a deep, angry red. He took a menacing step towards Punch. His stout stick, usually a tool of direction, now raised slightly, a silent threat. "What did you say?" Sweet's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried an immense, chilling power. Punch, despite the tremor that now ran through his body, did not back down. His gaze met Sweet's, unwavering. "My brother Kofi, he worked for Mr. Evans. He died last year. The boy has his face, his hands, his eyes. I need to know why." Sweet's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching violently in his cheek. He darted a quick glance around the field as if desperately checking to see who else might have overheard the incendiary words. The other servants, though pretending to resume their work, were clearly listening, their faces a tense mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Sweet then leaned in close to Punch, his voice a venomous hiss barely audible above the insects. "You don't ask questions like that, Punch. You don't even think them. You understand me? I just want to know." Punch began, his voice cracking slightly. "You want to know?" Sweet's voice suddenly rose, shattering the fragile calm, and the other servants flinched, recoiling from the sudden outburst. "You want to know why a white boy looks like your dead brother? You think that's a question you get to ask?" His eyes, usually cold and calculating, now blazed with a dangerous fury. Punch remained silent, his gaze fixed on Sweet, a silent challenge in his eyes. Sweet's hand, gripping the stick, was visibly shaking. He spun on his heel and strode purposefully towards the main house, his gait quick and angry, leaving a palpable tension in his wake. Gregory, his face etched with fear, immediately grabbed Punch's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "What have you done?" Gregory whispered, his voice urgent, laced with desperation. "You've just signed your own death warrant, man." Punch, his arm still trembling, pulled free from Gregory's grasp. "I had to know," he murmured, his voice hollow. Victor, ever the pragmatist, shook his head slowly, his pale blue eyes filled with a grim understanding. Knowing will kill you, Punch. Peter, the young Englishman, his face ashen, spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. He's right, Punch. Sweet's going to tell Gwyn, and Gwyn's going to... He stopped abruptly, unable to articulate the terrifying possibilities that hung in the air. Samuel, the older African, his face a mask of weary resignation, placed a comforting yet heavy hand on Punch's shoulder. You should run, he said quietly, his voice raspy with age and experience, tonight before they come for you. But Punch, consumed by a strange mixture of defiance and despair, did not run. He returned to his work, mechanically cutting the tobacco leaves and hanging them in the barn. His mind a whirlwind of racing thoughts. He had asked the question, and now there was no turning back, no way to unask it. Whatever terrifying consequences awaited him, he had spoken his truth, however dangerous, and the truth he knew would demand its price. What Punch, in his desperate search for answers, couldn't possibly have known, what he couldn't have even conceived, was that his single audacious question had just ignited a chain of even, a slow burning fuse that would ultimately rewrite the very laws of an entire continent. Because Robert, the overseer, did not in fact go directly to Hugh Gwyn that afternoon. He went to someone else, someone far more powerful, far more dangerous. That night, under the cold, indifferent gaze of a near full moon, Robert rode with a desperate urgency to the plantation of William Evans, the man who had once owned Kofi. The journey, a grueling 2 hours along the rough, unpaved dirt road that tenuously connected the isolated plantations along the winding James River, was a blur of pounding hooves and racing thoughts. The moonlight, stark and unforgiving, cast long, distorted shadows over the dense forests and sprawling fields, transforming the familiar landscape into something eerie and alien. The air, cooler now, was filled with the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful howl of a wolf, sounds that only amplified Sweet's gnawing anxiety. He spurred his horse onward, its hooves pounding a frantic rhythm against the packed earth, his mind a tumultuous storm of implications of the catastrophic potential unleashed by Punch's audacious question. William Evans was not merely a planter. He was a titan of the colony, a man of immense wealth and formidable influence, a prominent member of the Colonial Assembly. His connections stretched far and wide, reaching into the highest echelons of Virginia society. His plantation was one of the largest and most prosperous in the entire colony, boasting over 200 acres of meticulously cultivated tobacco fields, a grand, imposing main house constructed of brick and timber, and a small army of dozens of servants and laborers. Evans, in his mid-50s, was a tall, imposing figure, his graying hair meticulously combed, his face seemingly carved from granite, betraying little emotion. He was renowned for his sharp intellect, his relentless ambition, and a ruthless pragmatism that bordered on cruelty. He was also infamous for his explosive temper and for the swift, unforgiving manner in which he dealt with anyone, man, woman, or servant, who dared to threaten his meticulously constructed reputation or his vast financial interests. Sweet and Evans conversed for 2 tense, agonizing hours, closeted behind the heavy oak doors of Evans's opulent study. The room, usually a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, became a crucible of hushed whispers and rising tension. No one, save for the 2 men themselves, knew the precise words exchanged, but the house servants moving silently through the grand halls later reported hearing raised voices, the muffled sounds of furniture being abruptly moved, and at one particularly jarring moment, the distinct crash of breaking glass. When finally emerged from the study, his face was a ghastly pale, his hands visibly trembling, a testament to the terrifying nature of the conversation. He mounted his horse in silence, his eyes wide and haunted, and rode back to the Gwyn plantation without uttering a single word, leaving behind a palpable sense of dread. The very next morning, as the first tentative rays of dawn painted the eastern sky, Hugh Gwyn received an unexpected and ominous visit. William Evans arrived not alone, but accompanied by 2 other powerful planters. Thomas Warren, a formidable neighbor whose sprawling plantation lay to the north, and Richard Bennett, a stern, influential member of the Colonial Council. The three men, their faces grim and unyielding, dismounted their horses, tying them to the fence outside Gwyn's main house, their presence casting a long, unsettling shadow over the tranquil morning. They spoke with Gwyn on the porch for over an hour, their voices low and urgent, punctuated by tense silences. Eleanor Gwyn, her face pale and etched with anxiety, watched the clandestine meeting from the discreet vantage point of an upstairs window, her heart pounding with a nameless dread. Thomas Gwyn, the innocent boy whose striking resemblance to Kofi had ignited this entire crisis, was conspicuously absent, kept safely out of sight. When the hushed, intense meeting finally concluded, Gwyn's face was ashen, his usual composure shattered. He immediately summoned Sweet to the porch, and the two men conversed in low, urgent tones, their heads close together, their words indistinguishable. Then, with a chilling finality, Gwyn called for Punch, Gregory, and Victor. The three servants were summoned to the main house that afternoon, the sun beating down mercilessly on their heads as they stood in the dusty yard. Gwyn stood on the porch, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression utterly unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. Sweet stood beside him, his eyes usually so calculating, now cold and devoid of any warmth. "You three are leaving," Gwyn announced, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You're being transferred to a plantation in Maryland. You'll work there until your contracts are complete." Gregory, his brow furrowed in confusion and growing anger, stepped forward slightly. "Merrill, that's weeks away, Master Gwyn." "Why?" "Because I said so," Gwyn snapped, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting off any further protest. "You leave tomorrow morning." Victor, ever the calm, measured one, spoke up, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "What about our contracts, Master Gwyn? We signed to work here, not in Maryland. Our terms are for this plantation. Your contracts can be transferred." Gwyn stated, his tone dismissive. "It's perfectly legal. You'll work for a planter named John Dandy. He's expecting you." The name John Dandy hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement of their impending doom. Punch felt a cold, eeping dread spread through him, a chill that went deeper than the oppressive heat of the afternoon. This was no mere transfer. This was exile, a calculated, deliberate banishment, and he knew with a sickening certainty that it was all because of his question, his dangerous, truth-seeking question. That night, the three men huddled together in their cramped, dimly lit cabin, the single flickering candle casting dancing, distorted shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Gregory paced back and forth like a caged animal, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and desperate fear. Victor sat on his bunk, his knife moving with practiced, almost meditative precision as he carved a piece of wood, his expression thoughtful, his pale blue eyes distant. Punch sat on the dirt floor, his back pressed against the cold, unforgiving wall, his mind a frantic whirlwind of racing thoughts, desperately searching for a way out. "We can't go to Maryland," Gregory declared, his voice with desperation. "We'll never come back. They're sending us away to shut us up, to bury whatever Punch knows. They're sending Punch away." Victor corrected, his voice low and grim. "We're just collateral, Gregory. Unfortunate witnesses." Gregory stopped his frantic pacing and turned to Punch, his eyes wide with a desperate plea for understanding. "What did you see, Punch? What made you ask that question? What is so terrible that they would send us all away?" Punch, his voice barely a whisper, recounted the impossible truth. He told them about Kofi, his beloved brother, and the undeniable haunting resemblance between Kofi and young Thomas Gwyn. He spoke of the whispers he had painstakingly gathered, the fragments of gossip that had coalesced into a terrifying narrative. He told them about Margaret Evans, the beautiful, lonely wife of the powerful planter, and the hushed rumors of her forbidden relationship with Kofi. He spoke of Kofi's sudden suspicious death, officially attributed to fever, but whispered to be something far more sinister. And then, with a chilling clarity, he laid bare the truth he had painstakingly pieced together, that Thomas Gwyn was not Hugh Gwyn's son, but Kofi's, a secret born of a forbidden union, a secret that threatened to unravel the very foundations of colonial society. Gregory stared at him, his mouth agape, his face a mask of utter disbelief and dawning horror. Victor, his carving knife momentarily forgotten, looked up, his pale blue eyes wide with shock. "Jesus Christ!" Gregory whispered, the blasphemy escaping his lips almost unconsciously. "You're saying the boy is half African, that he's Kofi's son. I'm saying the boy is my brother's son." Punch affirmed quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. Victor slowly shook his head, his gaze distant. "If that's true, Punch, and if anyone ever finds out, it will destroy the Gwynn family and the Evans family and probably half the powerful planters in Virginia. It would be a scandal that would shake the colony to its very core. That's why they're sending us away," Gregory concluded, his voice filled with a grim certainty. "They're going to bury this secret, and they're going to bury us with it far away in Maryland when no one will ever hear us." Punch looked at the two men, his eyes filled with a desperate resolve. "We have to run," he stated, his voice firm. "Tonight, before they can take us," Gregory, after a moment of stunned silence, nodded decisively. "Tonight, Victor." After a long, thoughtful pause, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame, finally nodded as well. "Tonight," he echoed, his voice a low, determined rumble. They vanished into the pre-dawn darkness, taking nothing but the worn clothes on their backs and a small, meager sack of cornmeal. Their only provisions against the vase, unforgiving wilderness. They headed north, their desperate hope fixed on the distant, elusive promise of Maryland, a land they believed might offer them a chance at freedom, a chance to disappear into the burgeoning population of free laborers. Their plan was simple. Born of desperation, reach Maryland, find work, and melt away into anonymity. But they were not alone in the vast, silent wilderness. Robert, the ever-vigilant overseer, had anticipated their desperate flight. He had sent word ahead, his warnings carried by swift riders, and by the time Punch, Gregory, and Victor, exhausted and terrified, reached the ill-defined border that separated Virginia from Maryland, a formidable group of armed planters, their faces grim and determined, was waiting for them. The capture was swift, brutal, and utterly devoid of mercy. The three desperate men, their bodies aching from days of relentless travel through the unforgiving wilderness, were suddenly surrounded. 6 armed planters, mounted on powerful horses, emerged from the dense undergrowth, their muskets glinting ominously in the pale morning light, their faces hard and unyielding. There was no chance to run, no opportunity to fight. The odds were overwhelmingly against them. Their desperate bid for freedom extinguished in an instant. Punch, Gregory, and Victor were roughly bound with thick ropes, their hands tied painfully behind their backs, their hopes crushed. They were then forced to march back to Virginia on foot, a humiliating, agonizing journey that stretched over 3 brutal days. They were given precious little food, barely enough to sustain them, and even less water, their throats parched, their bodies pushed to the brink of collapse. By the time they finally reached Jamestown, the colonial capital, they were utterly exhausted, their skin raw and blistered from the relentless sun, their clothes filthy and worn, their spirits broken, and their hearts filled with a profound, chilling terror. The colonial court convened on July 9, 1640, a date that would forever be etched in the grim annals of American history. The courtroom itself was a small, claustrophobic wooden building nestled near the bustling, dusty center of Jamestown. It was hot and airless, the oppressive humidity clinging to everything, and the narrow, grimy windows offered little respite, letting in only slivers of weak, diffused light. The room was packed to capacity, a suffocating throng of planters, their faces stern and expectant, curious servants, and a smattering of curious onlookers who had come to witness the spectacle of justice, or perhaps something far more sinister. Punch, Gregory, and Victor stood in the very center of the room, their hands still bound, their clothes filthy and torn, their bodies swaying slightly with exhaustion. The judge, a formidable figure named Sir Francis Wyatt, the governor of Virginia himself, presided over the proceedings. He was a stern, imposing man, his graying hair meticulously combed, his face seemingly carved from granite, betraying not a flicker of emotion. His presence alone commanded an absolute chilling authority. Hugh Gwynn, Punch's master, testified first. He stood before the court, his posture rigid, his voice steady and controlled, a master of calculated deception. He meticulously described the three men as disobedient, ungrateful, and utterly untrustworthy servants. He recounted their flight, painting them as rebellious and defiant, and he demanded with a chilling lack of remorse that their terms of servitude be extended as a just and fitting punishment for their transgression. The court listened in a profound, unsettling silence. The only sound, the rhythmic scratching of the clerk's quill as he meticulously recorded every damning word of the testimony. Then Robert, the overseer, took the stand. He walked to the front of the courtroom with a deliberate, measured pace, his face a mask of carefully constructed impassivity. He placed his hand on the worn leather of the Bible, his oath a chilling formality. His testimony, delivered with a deceptive calm, was careful, precise, and utterly devastating in its implications. "The African John Punch," Sweet began, his voice clear and steady, resonating through the hushed courtroom, asked me a question about my master's son, a question that suggested impropry. The word impropry hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations, a thinly veiled euphemism for something far more scandalous. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of hushed whispers and shocked gasps. Governor Wyatt, his eyes narrowing to slits, leaned forward, his gaze fixed intently on Sweet. "What kind of question?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Sweet hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, as if genuinely reluctant to speak the words aloud, to give voice to such a dangerous truth. Then, with a theatrical sigh, he finally uttered them. He asked why the boy looked like his brother, a dead African who worked for Mr. Evans. A palpable gasp swept through the courtroom. Wyatt's face darkened perceptibly, a storm cloud gathering in his eyes. He slowly turned his gaze towards Punch, his expression cold, hard, and utterly devoid of sympathy. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice a low, menacing rumble. Punch, despite the profound fear that now gripped him, met the governor-unc's gaze, his own eyes unwavering. His voice, though quiet, was steady, imbued with a desperate, defiant courage. "Yes, sir," I asked, "because I wanted to know the truth." "The truth?" Wyatt repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. The word a bitter accusation? He then cast a fleeting, significant glance at William Evans, who sat in the front row, his face a mask of carefully cultivated impassivity, his eyes betraying nothing. Then Wyatt's gaze snapped back to Punch, his voice now laced with a chilling finality. "The truth, boy, is not yours to seek." The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of murmurs and whispers, a wave of agitated voices washing over the proceedings. Wyatt, his face a thundercloud of barely suppressed rage, banged his gavel repeatedly, his sharp commands for order cutting through the din. When a semblance of silence was finally restored, he turned his attention to the other two defendants. "Gregory and Victor." "James Gregory and Victor," Wyatt declared, his voice cold and unyielding, "you are guilty of the grave offense of running away from your master. For this transgression, you are hereby sentenced to an additional 4 years of servitude to be served after the completion of your current contracts. Furthermore, you will each receive 30 lashes, a punishment to be administered immediately as a stark reminder of the consequences of defiance." Gregory's face went ghastly pale, his eyes wide with shock and despair. Victor, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched violently in his cheek, closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable pain. Then, with a dramatic, agonizing pause that stretched the tension in the courtroom to its breaking point, Wyatt turned his full, unwavering attention to Punch. The entire courtroom fell into a profound, breathless silence, every single eye fixed intently on the judge, anticipating the pronouncement of Punch's fate. "John Punch," Wyatt began, his voice slow, deliberate, and imbued with a chilling, almost ceremonial finality. "You are guilty of running away from your master, but your crime, Punch, is far greater than mere flight. You have dared to question the honor of your betters. You have suggested impropriety where By the order of our society, none can exist. You have by your audacious inquiry threatened the very social order of this colony, a delicate balance we strive to maintain. For these grave crimes, for this unforgivable transgression against the established order, you are hereby sentenced to serve your master, Hugh Gwynn, for the remainder of your natural life. The courtroom erupted. A collective gasp, followed by a wave of shocked murmurs, swept through the assembled crowd. Punch stared at Wyatt, his mind reeling, utterly unable to comprehend the horrifying words he had just heard. Life servitude, not 4 years like Gregory and Victor, not 10 years or 20, but life, his entire existence from this moment forward, irrevocably bound, without hope of freedom. Gregory and Victor were roughly led away, their faces pale with shock and despair, their fate sealed. Punch remained standing in the center of the courtroom, his hands still bound, his mind a chaotic maelstrom of disbelief and crushing despair. He had asked a question, a simple, desperate question, and the answer, delivered with such cold, legalistic precision, had cost him everything: his freedom, his future, his very humanity, all stripped away in a single chilling pronouncement. But the story, in its grim unfolding, did not end there. For what transpired in that stifling Jamestown courtroom, the chilling sentence handed down to John Punch, was not merely a punishment for a perceived transgression. It was a precedent, a legal cornerstone laid in the blood and despair of one man that would forever alter the course of a nation. And the question he dared to ask, the question that had, in its profound simplicity, hanged the overseer's conscience and buried a scandalous truth, would echo through the centuries, a silent, haunting testament to the insidious power of injustice. Punch was returned to Hugh Gwynn's plantation, but he was no longer the same man. The brutal whipping he received, 30 lashes administered with a cruel efficiency, the same number as Gregory and Victor, left raw, angry welts on his back, scars that would never fully heal, a constant searing reminder of his punishment. But the deeper scars were invisible, etched not on his flesh, but into the very fabric of his mind and soul. They were carved by the crushing weight of the knowledge that he would never again know freedom, that his life, from this moment forward, was irrevocably bound to the will of another. The hope that had sustained him through the horrors of the Middle Passage, through the relentless toil of the tobacco fields, had been extinguished, replaced by a profound, chilling despair. The other servants, once his companions in shared hardship, now avoided him, their gazes averted, their whispers hushed. They feared him, not for any malice he possessed, but for the terrifying precedent his fate represented. They saw in Punch's perpetual bondage a chilling glimpse of their own potential future, a future where the color of one's skin, rather than the terms of a contract, could determine one's destiny. Gregory and Victor, after enduring their own brutal whippings, were summarily sent to work on a different, more remote part of the plantation, a deliberate act of separation, and Punch rarely saw them again, their camaraderie a distant, painful memory. Hugh Gwynn, his master, treated him with a cold, calculated indifference, speaking to him only to issue terse commands, his eyes carefully avoiding Punch's as if to deny the very humanity of the man he now owned for life. And Robert, the overseer, watched him with an almost predatory intensity, his gaze constant, ever vigilant, as if perpetually expecting Punch to attempt another desperate flight, as if waiting for any pretext, any slight misstep, to inflict further punishment. But Punch, in his profound despair, did not run. He worked, he obeyed, and he watched. He watched the seasons turn, the tobacco plants grow and wither, the river flow endlessly towards the sea. And he watched Thomas Gwynn. Thomas Gwynn grew older, transforming from a quiet boy into a young man. By 1645, he was 19, tall and strong, his frame filling out, his movements acquiring a confident grace. He possessed his mother's pale, refined skin and his father's ambitious, determined jawline. He had completed his education in England, returning to Virginia with the polished accent and sophisticated manners of the English gentry. He was being meticulously groomed to inherit his father's burgeoning plantation, to become a planter in his own right, to marry well into a prominent colonial family, and to produce heirs who would proudly carry on the Gwynn name, securing the family's legacy in the New World. But his eyes, those dark, deep pools that held a peculiar intensity, his hands long and elegant, his very way of moving, a subtle fluidity in his gait, they were still undeniably Kofi's. Punch saw it every single day, in every fleeting glance, in every unconscious gesture, and every day the burning question, the impossible truth gnawed at him, a relentless internal fire. Why? Why did this young man, this scion of a prominent English family, carry the unmistakable features of his deceased African brother? And why, in the cruel calculus of colonial justice, had that question cost Punch his freedom, his very life? The answer, in its horrifying entirety, came to Punch in fragments pieced together over years of silent observation and hushed whispers. It came from the older servants, those who had been at the Evans plantation, those who remembered the past with a clarity born of fear and resentment. It came from snippets of overheard conversations between planters, their voices lower, their words carefully chosen, yet revealing enough for Punch's keen, watchful mind to connect the dots. The truth, like a grotesque mosaic, slowly, painfully began to form, each piece a chilling revelation. Margaret Evans, the beautiful, lonely wife of the powerful William Evans, had indeed been profoundly isolated. Her husband, a man consumed by his work, by his relentless ambition, by his singular desire to forge an empire in the untamed Virginia wilderness, was perpetually absent. He was often away, traveling to England on important business, attending the interminable meetings of the Colonial Assembly in Jamestown, or visiting other plantations to negotiate intricate deals and forge strategic alliances. Margaret was left alone in the grand, imposing main house, its spacious rooms echoing with a profound emptiness, her only constant companions, the silent house servants. Kofi Punch's brother had been assigned to work in the main house. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed a quiet dignity that set him apart from the other field laborers. He tended the sprawling gardens, meticulously repaired the intricate furniture, and performed the myriad small tasks that kept the vast household running smoothly. Margaret, in her profound loneliness, had noticed him. Over time, their interactions, initially formal and distant, had deepened, evolving into something far more intimate, far more dangerous. Their relationship, born of isolation and a desperate human connection, had been brief, intensely secret, and fraught with immense peril, a union that brazenly violated every rigid social norm of the colony, a transgression that threatened to utterly destroy both their lives and the lives of those around them if it were ever discovered. When Margaret, to her utter horror, discovered she was pregnant, she was consumed by a desperate, blinding panic. She initially claimed. The child was her husband's, conceived during one of his rare fleeting visits home, but the timing, she knew with a sickening certainty, was wrong. The dates simply did not align. So in a desperate attempt to preserve her reputation and avert a catastrophic scandal, she made a chilling decision. She would send the child, her newborn son, to England to be raised by distant relatives far from the prying eyes of Virginia society, far from the damning truth of his parentage, and she would ensure with every fiber of her being that no one, absolutely no one, would ever uncover the secret. But Kofi knew, and when he finally realized the horrifying truth, when he understood that his son, his own flesh and blood, had been cruelly taken from him and sent across the vast ocean, he confronted Margaret. It was a fatal mistake. Margaret, consumed by a primal terror that her meticulously guarded secret would be irrevocably revealed, that her world would shatter, confessed everything to her husband, William Evans. And William Evans, a man of immense power, of unyielding pride, and of ruthless pragmatism, ensured that Kofi would never speak of it again. Kofi's death, officially attributed to a common fever, was no natural occurrence. It was murder meticulously disguised as illness, his body hastily buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the Evans plantation. The house servants, those who had been forced to prepare his body for burial, whispered in hushed, terrified tones about the faint telltale bruises on his neck, about the way his eyes, wide and staring, seemed to be frozen in an expression of unspeakable terror. But no one, absolutely no one, dared to speak openly of what they had seen. No one dared to question the official narrative. The fear of William Evans and the unspoken threat of similar fates silenced them all. And when John Punch, driven by an unyielding need for truth, Ed to ask his question when he threatened to unravel the meticulously constructed lie, the powerful planters, Gwynn, Evans, Sweet, and their influential allies acted swiftly and decisively. They ensured that Punch would never again be free to speak to reveal the devastating truth. They manipulated the Nahant legal system, twisting its net principles to silence him, and in doing so, they inadvertently, chillingly created a new, far more insidious form of bondage, a bondage not of contract, but of race, just when we thought we'd plumbed the depths of this colonial horror. The sinister undercurrents in Virginia intensify, revealing layers of deceit and injustice that are almost too chilling to comprehend. If this unfolding narrative is sending shivers down your spine, if the weight of this forgotten history grips you, then share this video with a friend who, like you, appreciates the darkest mysteries of the past. Hit that like button to support our channel and help us unearth more of these hidden truths. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story like this. Let's continue our journey together as we discover the harrowing climax of John Punch's tragic quest for truth. The year is 1650. A decade had passed since that fateful day in the Jamestown courtroom. 10 long, arduous years since John Punch was condemned to a life without end, a life without freedom. He was now 40 years old. His body, once lean and powerful, now worn and stooped by the relentless, soul-crushing labor of the tobacco fields. His spirit, though unbroken, was hardened by the unyielding weight of injustice, by the constant gnawing despair of his perpetual servitude. His hands, once skilled and nimble, were now gnarled and scarred, the skin thick and calloused from years of gripping hoes and cutting tobacco leaves. His back, once straight and proud, was now permanently bent, a testament to the endless hours spent stooping over the plants. His face, once smooth and youthful, was now deeply lined, etched with the indelible marks of sun, wind, and an unspeakable suffering. But through it all, through the physical pain and the emotional torment, he had not forgotten. The truth, the impossible, dangerous truth, remained a burning ember within him, a silent, defiant flame. One evening, as the sun, a fiery orb, began its slow descent below the western horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the sprawling tobacco fields, Punch found himself approached by a young servant. The boy, barely 16, was named Samuel. He had arrived at the plantation just 2 years prior, a fresh-faced English orphan who, like so many others, had sold himself into servitude, a desperate escape from the grinding poverty and bleak prospects of London's unforgiving streets. Samuel was a curious boy, unusually so for his age, with an innate intelligence that shone in his bright, inquisitive eyes. He possessed a rare, almost reckless courage, unafraid to ask questions, to challenge the unspoken norms, qualities that, in a painful echo of his own youth, reminded Punch of himself many, many years ago. "Mr. Punch," Samuel began, his voice barely a whisper, trembling slightly with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Is it true? Did you really ask why the master's son looked like your brother?" Punch, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun was now a mere sliver of orange, turned slowly to face the boy. He looked at Samuel for a long, silent moment, his eyes, deep and ancient, searching the boy's earnest face. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he confirmed the impossible. "I did." Samuel's young face was a mask of disbelief.
"And they made you a slave for life because of it, just for asking a question?"
"Yes," Punch affirmed, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "A testament to the years of suppressed pain."
Samuel's eyes, wide and innocent, filled with unshed tears, reflecting the fiery hues of the setting sun. "That's not right," he whispered, his voice choked with a profound sense of injustice. "That's not justice, Mr. Punch, Punch."
His movements, slow and deliberate, reached out and placed a gnarled, calloused hand on the boy's slender shoulder. The weight of his hand, heavy with years of toil and sorrow, seemed to convey a lifetime of unspoken truths. "No," he said quietly, his voice raspy with age and resignation. "It's not, but it's the world we live in now, Samuel, the world they have made." Samuel looked up at him, his face pale in the fading light, his youthful eyes filled with a desperate, unspoken plea. "Will it always be this way, Mr. Punch? Will it always be this way for us?" Punch did not answer. He couldn't. He didn't know. But he knew one thing with an absolute chilling certainty. The question he had asked, the dangerous, truth-seeking question that had cost him everything, was a question that would not die with him. It was a question that would be asked again and again by others who came after him, by those who would suffer under the very system his sentence had helped to forge. And one day, perhaps in a distant, unimaginable future, someone would finally find the answer. Someone would finally speak the truth that had been so brutally suppressed. That night, as the last vestiges of twilight faded and the vast, star-studded canvas of the colonial sky unfolded above him, Punch lay on his rough straw pallet in the cramped, silent cabin. He stared up at the dark, unseen ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the plantation settling into its uneasy sleep. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze, the soft creak of the cabin walls. His mind, however, was far from peaceful. It was a maelstrom of memories, of ghosts and regrets. He thought of Kofi, his beloved brother, the vibrant, intelligent man torn from his side, the brother he had lost not once, but twice. First to the slave traders, then to the planters' dark conspiracy. He thought of the son Kofi had never known, the boy who carried his brother's features, the boy who walked among them, a living, breathing testament to a forbidden love and a brutal murder. He thought of Thomas Gwynn, the young man who, in his innocence, bore the physical legacy of a truth too dangerous to be spoken, a truth that would forever remain hidden from him. And he thought endlessly of the question, the simple, dangerous question that had shattered his world, that had irrevocably changed his life, and in a chilling twist of fate, had laid the very foundation for the institution of slavery in English America. Why does young master look exactly like my brother? The answer, he knew, was buried deep beneath layers of secrets and lies, meticulously constructed by men driven by fear, by pride, by an unyielding desire to protect their reputations and their fragile social order. The answer was written not in ink on paper, but in the very laws of Virginia, in the cold legalistic pronouncements of the court records that had condemned Punch to life servitude. It was enshrined in the chilling precedent that would be used again and again to justify the enslavement of millions, to strip them of their humanity, to reduce them to mere property. The answer, in its most visceral form, was in the blood that ran through Thomas Gwynn's veins, the undeniable blood of an African man and an English woman mixed in a union that the colony, in its rigid adherence to racial hierarchy, could never acknowledge, could never accept, could never forgive. And the answer, perhaps most profoundly, was in the silence. The suffocating, pervasive silence that fell over the plantation whenever Punch's name was mentioned, whenever the events of 1640 were even hinted at, the silence that surrounded Kofi's unmarked grave, a silent testament to a life brutally extinguished, a truth deliberately buried, the silence that would last for centuries, a heavy shroud over a dark foundational chapter of American history. John Punch died in 1655, still a servant, still bound to Hugh Gwynn's plantation, his life ending as it had been legally defined 15 years prior, in perpetual servitude. His death, like his life, was recorded with a chilling brevity in the colonial register, a single stark line that spoke volumes in its omissions. John Punch, African deceased, There was no mention of his age, no official cause of death, no acknowledgment of his life, his audacious question, or the profound tragic fate that had befallen him. His existence, in the official records, was reduced to a mere footnote, a statistic. He was buried, as was the custom for those of his station, in an unmarked grave at the edge of the plantation, in a small desolate plot of land where the other servants, both European and African, were laid to rest. There was no ceremony, no eulogy, no words spoken over his body, no marker, no stone, no cross to show where he lay. Within a year, the relentless Virginia grass had grown thick and wild over the disturbed earth, erasing any visible trace of his final resting place. It was as if John Punch, the man who dared to ask, had never truly existed, but his legacy, though buried and silenced, lived on. The legal precedent set by his case, the chilling distinction of life's servitude for an African, while Europeans, even for the same offense, received only extended contracts, became the insidious foundation for the institution of slavery in English America within a single generation, the Virginia Assembly, influenced by the very legal framework established by Punch's sentencing, would begin to pass a series of increasingly restrictive laws. These statutes would systematically codify race-based slavery, making it hereditary, permanent, and inextricably linked to African descent. By 1700, less than 60 years after Punch's trial, slavery had become the undisputed economic engine of the colonial economy, a brutal system of exploitation and oppression that would endure for over 200 years, shaping the very identity and destiny of a nation. The question John Punch asked, the question that cost him his freedom, would be answered with chains, with whips, with the systematic dehumanization of millions, and with centuries of unimaginable suffering. Thomas Gwynn, the young man whose striking resemblance to Kofi had ignited this entire tragic saga, grew up, inherited his father's prosperous plantation, and lived a long, seemingly fulfilling life. He married well, taking as his wife the daughter of another wealthy, influential planter, further solidifying his family's position in colonial society. He had children of his own, heirs who would proudly carry on the Gwynn name, children who would never know the devastating truth about their grandfather, about the African man whose blood, in a cruel twist of fate, ran through their very veins. Thomas became a respected member of the Colonial Assembly, a man of considerable influence and power, a revered pillar of Virginia society. He never knew the truth about his origins, or if he did, if some faint, unsettling whisper of it ever reached him, he never spoke of it. The SEC, Rhett, like a venomous serpent, died with him, buried as deeply and as irrevocably as John Punch's unmarked grave. Robert, the overseer whose testimony had sealed Punch's fate, disappeared from the colonial record sometime around 1652. His ultimate fate remains shrouded in mystery. Some whispered that he drank himself to an early grave, haunted by the dangerous question Punch had asked, by the chilling knowledge of what he had done, of the role he had played in forging a new kind of bondage. Others speculated that he simply left Virginia, unable to live with the crushing weight of his conscience, unable to face the man he had helped to condemn. His disappearance, like so many other uncomfortable truths of the era, was simply absorbed into the vast silent landscape of colonial life. Hugh Gwynn, Punch's master, continued to prosper. His plantation grew, his wealth increased exponentially, and he became, by all accounts, one of the most successful and respected planters in Virginia. He never spoke of John Punch, never mentioned the infamous trial, never acknowledged the pivotal, chilling role he had played in creating the legal precedent that would define American slavery. When he died in 1663, he was buried with full honors in the churchyard in Jamestown, his grave marked with an imposing stone that lauded his significant contributions to the burgeoning colony. Elalina Gwynn, Hugh's wife, lived until 1670. She spent her final years largely confined to the Grand Main House, rarely venturing outside, her health slowly declining, perhaps under the immense unspoken weight of the secrets she carried. She never spoke of Margaret Evans, never mentioned Kofi, never acknowledged the devastating truth that as a woman living within the confines of that house, she must have known, or at least suspected. When she finally passed, she was buried beside her husband. And the secrets Lee, he, the dust of ages, died with her. William Evans, the powerful planter who had owned Kofi, continued to serve in the Colonial Assembly until his death in 1659. He remained a formidable, influential figure, a man who actively shaped the laws and policies of Virginia, a man whose word carried immense weight. He never spoke of Kofi, never mentioned the African servant who had worked in his house, never acknowledged the forbidden relationship between his wife and the man he had murdered. His reputation remained meticulously intact, his legacy as a respected, powerful planter utterly secure. And the question itself, why does young master look exactly like my brother, was buried deep within the colonial archives, a forgotten whisper in dusty court records, lost to the collective memory for centuries. It remained there, a silent, haunting testament to a truth too dangerous to be spoken, until diligent historians poring over faded documents painstakingly uncovered the court records and meticulously pieced together the harrowing story of the man who dared to ask it. In 1640, the Virginia court, in its chilling wisdom, sentenced John Punch to life servitude, thereby creating the first legal precedent for race-based slavery in English America. Within 2 decades, the Virginia Assembly, building upon this insidious foundation, would pass a series of laws that systematically codified slavery, making it hereditary and permanent for all people of African descent. By the turn of the 18th century, slavery had become the undisputed bedrock of the colonial economy, a brutal system of exploitation and oppression that would endure for over 200 years, leaving an indelible, painful scar on the soul of a nation. The question John Punch asked in his desperate search for truth was never answered in his lifetime, but it echoed a silent, persistent lament through the centuries. It was asked, Aga, in and again by the millions of people who were enslaved, who were denied their fundamental freedom, who were treated as mere property rather than as human beings. It was asked by the courageous abolitionists who fought tirelessly to dismantle the monstrous institution of slavery, by the soldiers who shed their blood in the brutal crucible of the Civil War, by the civil rights activists who marched and struggled for equality. And in many ways, that question has never stopped echoing. It is still being asked today. It is asked by historians who patiently piece together lives erased from the record, by descendants who search courageously for the truth buried in their bloodlines, and by a nation still struggling to confront the painful inheritance of slavery and the unresolved meaning of freedom itself. The story of John Punch is not a footnote in history. It is a warning, a haunting reminder that history is shaped not only by the powerful and celebrated, but by ordinary people whose lives were forever altered by decisions they never consented to, people whose voices were deliberately silenced, whose stories were hidden, distorted, or erased altogether. It is proof that the past is never truly behind us, that the questions we wrestle with today are the same questions whispered centuries ago, and that the pursuit of truth and justice is not a destination, but a struggle that humanity never escapes. This unsettling mystery, pulled from the dust-covered archives of colonial Virginia, shows how a single, audacious question, simple in its wording yet devastating in its impact, can permanently alter the course of history. It reveals the terrible price that truth can demand, and how injustice, once embedded in law, can endure across generations. So now we ask you, what do you think of this story? Was justice ever truly served for John Punch? Should the devastating truth about Tom, as Gwyn's origins have been exposed, no matter the consequences? Share your thoughts, your reflections, and your emotions in the comments below. And if this immersive journey into history has held you captive, if the shadows of this forgotten past have stirred something within you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who, like you, is drawn to the most profound and unsettling mysteries of history. Join us next time. as we continue uncovering the forgotten narratives that still shape our world today.